So welcome everybody. We are having this talk in the context of the Parallel Review Lisbon that could not happen physically, unfortunately. So we are transferring it to an online version of it. And this talk in particular is in the context of the exhibition, The Future is Not Guilty. So I give the word to Sandra, our moderator.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Good afternoon, my name is Sandra Jürgens, and I will be moderating the conversation with Yuliya Ruzhechka, cultural project manager, photographer, journalist, and the curator of the exhibition, The Future is Not Guilty, and Luce Lebart, historian of photography and exhibition curator, and French correspondent for Archive of Modern Conflict, a collection and publishing house based in between London and Toronto. Let me start by thanking to Yuliya and Luce, and also the organizers for providing us this great opportunity to discuss topical issues around the archives. Let's talk about archives, okay? In this conversation, we will talk about the construction of archives, and I will raise some questions that will feed this conversation between us. Archives are more prominent than ever, not only in the theoretical discourse, but also in curatorial and artistic practices. In the last few years and even decades, the artistic environment and artistic practices have been very involved in reflecting on the concept of archive and its construction practices. This was a trend which can be called archival turn, that had highlight with the publication of an archival impulse by Ol Foster and the exhibition Archive Fever by Oakville Emzor. From there, many reflections followed. In your opinion, Yuliya and Luce, what does this interest and search correspond to?
Would you like to start?
Yes.
Yes, Yuliya, please.
So, regarding this question, I'm tempted to answer a bit provocatively by saying that concerning photography, I think this term has always existed since the very origins of photography, notably in the context of the invention and experimentation on the medium. So this is the answer I would give from where I stand, a French historian and a curator who has been searching and managing different collections of photography, notably the French Society of Photography in Paris. And I have often observed that reappropriation of documents, archives, and more specifically photographic documents, is something that is really part of its development and multiple invention. Of course, there is a great difference between those practices and today's contemporary practices, because of course at that time there were no artistic intention, so no artistic purpose. So I would just give one or two examples, like Nicéphore Niepce, who worked from engravings of Cardinal Lemoine and used them to develop its heliography process, and many others inventors, such as, for example, the inventor of the tintype, Martin, he was French, maybe there were other inventors in the US, but we had a French inventor of tintypes, and he worked for many images that came from different archives. And I want to show you one image or two, if it's possible. Can I share my screen? Yeah. So this is an example of images produced in the 1850s by two chemists who were working on the let's say, the preservation of photo silver processes. And it's very interesting because they've used images, sometimes famous images from Hippolyte Bayard, like this one is from Hippolyte Bayard, one of the inventor of positive direct process. And they recycle them, they cut them, they reuse them, you know. And in this practice, it often happens. And it's strange because it's, in a way, it's, of course, they didn't have any artistic intention, but the result is very contemporary. It's like a monument, heritage, and they cut it into, it's very disruptive, like to tore images like that. Anyway, this was just to say that, so I have to stop that, sorry. Okay. So this is typical of the photo archives. The images which have not been produced with an artistic ambition or aim. And the question of the author is not important here. They're often anonymous. Well, this doesn't mean that there are no photographers behind, but those photos are documents. And that's why they are so attractive for reappropriation and for creativity. And this is, I just wanted to mention it because this is one of the reasons why I love so much photo archive, because of their infinite potential as a material to reactivate. And I just wanted to say as well that well before 2008, the surrealists have been very good as well as detourning documents and notably photo documents. To my point of view, maybe before this 2008 exhibition, that I must admit I didn't see, so that's why something happened for me, from my experience in 2005, when a conference was given by Spanish artist Juan Fontcuberta in Teatro Antigdal, where he urged photographers to stop taking photos, but to use instead photos that have already been produced, like
appropriations.
And this was very radical at that time. But of course, reappropriation doesn't necessarily mean thinking the archive or questioning it. I agree. And what is true is that now the word archive, I think it's important to also talk about the meaning of archive, of the word archive. And today it means everything. I mean, it's broadly used and it encompasses definition meanings such as document, memory. Sometimes you can see this word used to talk about history. And we talk about a photographer archive. It can mean its negatives, or it can be its family photos, or maybe photo he collected on eBay or anywhere else. But yes, I agree. Very probably this exhibition, Archive Fever, did state that archival documents are an amazing material for creation. But of course, this is not something new for historians. Since Lucien Febvre in France and many others in other countries, historians have reworked and revisioned archive and worked on the organization of archive, this imaginary of archive. But yes, well, this is to create other history than the official one. Well, this is a bit of a strange answer I've given you, but
no, thank you.
A bit around the subject.
I think it's very interesting actually, because I was taking notes while you were talking, Luce, and I think it resonates really well also with how did we try to approach the archives in our project, because also, as you said, the archive and interest in it is something very proper to photography somehow. And I'm thinking, for example, about Abby Warburg Atlas, which is a sort of archive, but something very important for photography and for the research, and how Georges de Huberman founded his work. on the base of Abbey Warburg Atlas, and it was in 1920s. So actually it's something very, very old somehow. And he questioned somehow collecting images, this idea of collecting and idea of the context. How, depending on the context where you show and re-show the archives, their meaning can change and evolve somehow. And how can it influence our perception of what is contained in the archive if we show one single image or some mix of images? So whether if we think about digital projects, for example, it's a totally different perception than, for example, a physicality of images that have this material meaning, and where also the visitor or the spectator engage very differently. And also it's very interesting because Luce told about importance or rather importance of the authorship of many archives. And it's very interesting because we have this tendency of turning to vernacular photography now and valorizing this family photography, etc. But also in terms of this project, The Future is Not Guilty, we merged somehow the works of the artists. It was really a collaborative project, and you can see, for example, in the publication, in the card, or in the interactive part on the web, that you cannot see the names of the artists on these particular parts of the work. And actually it was really meaningful for us as a group, not to attach the attention of the visitor or the reader to the name, but rather to give them this somehow material, and they, the visitors, readers, or users, they create their own constellations and senses with what we can show. And also each artist project evolved in these talks and common curatorial process. And I think it's something very important as well to mention regarding this project. And also to reply to this question, I think why now this interest to the archives is growing. I think that it also connects our reflection to on where we are from and where are we going somehow is the humanity. And it's something very proper to our time, like how our society evolved. And also in these very uncertain times, for example, of pandemic and different sorts of crisis, actually, where we question all these somehow philosophical or social issues, and archive give us not the answers to that, but it opens different doors and different questions. And I think that by diving into archives, somehow we are searching for these answers, actually.
And what do you think was the greatest contribution of these discursive and artistic practices to this context of reflection about the construction of archives? The affirmation of subjectivity, the fiction inherent in the construction of archives, or the process of selection, exclusion, and consequently the invisibility of much information, or the assumption that archive is never neutral? What the most important in this line?
Well, if I start, I think it's actually somehow the mix of each of these concepts, because archive, as I perceive it, it's rather a kaleidoscope that you hold in your hands, and you have these different elements, and by turning, somehow it gives you each time different perspective on what do you see through it, but also each of these elements and each of these concepts, you know, they merge differently, they connect differently. And this is the force of an archive, that you have so many aspects that compose it, and that we always need to take into consideration, like who is talking actually, from whose point of view this archive is composed, who is using it, and who has somehow the key of reading it, the accessibility of an archive, and also this idea of neutrality, which is very complicated, because even if when we try to make something, to create something very neutral, it's always a point of view as a photography. Even in reportage photography, actually, it's always a point and a part of the reality. And that's also the richness of what's this archive. And I think that what's very interesting is in questioning the medium of an archive is to say that it's actually between fiction and documentary, between past and future, and it's rather between different concepts. And it's not something which is set on stone. It's something that evolves constantly, depending on the time, on the context, on our society, how it evolves, and also on how do we use it in each single time. How do we approach it?
For me, it's difficult to answer because I have my link to archive is not global. I mean, I love archive in general. I don't know exactly what it means in general because, but my interest is always linked to one archive in particular. I always start from the material, from the corpus in French, we say, the group of image. Whether it is a huge collection like the National Research Center collection, like it can be a small collection of autochromes I've found under a shelf and it had been immersed in water. So I always, my thinking, my thought about the archive always start from the archive itself. It doesn't mean I'm not interested in any other approach of archive. I've been very, very excited, totally also troubled when I was a teenager by exhibition, two main big exhibition, one by Christian Boltanski in the late 80s, the beginning of the 90s, and another one by Feldman. And I must say, thanks to your question, I've been rethinking about it, and I must admit, it's a lot. What I have to say is not much. It's a lot about feeling, because those approaches to archive are, to me, very comparable to what I feel when I am in front of a new material. It's immersion, you know, those immersion, this idea of immersion in a mass of documents. And when each time I experiment Christian Boltanski, for me, it's very hard to conceptualize or intellectualize it. I went recently with my son to a wonderful like performance of Boltanski, and he had more concepts, much more analyzed than me when I went out, because for me it's very emotional. It's something, and for me archive is a lot about emotion, you know. So but of course I've been influenced also by I've been fascinated by archive of modern conflict approach of archives in photos, which has very much, I think, impacted the world of photo book from the beginning of the 21st century. And but yes, I have an approach to photography also that is archive, that is very linked, I think, to my first encounter with the photo archive, which is common to, I think, many other people of my generation, which is family photographs in a shoebox, in a suitcase. And
amateur photography.
Yes, I think it's very important for a whole generation. It will be not the same in the future, I guess, because of the change of materiality, etc. But of course, this pleasure I had as a kid to discover the country where my parents came from, that was another country because they immigrated to France, and to travel into space and into time through images like that I could have in hand, etc. I think my work today is very linked. I react this. I often react this experience, and so I have a less intellectual approach maybe of the archive. I'm not, it's stupid to say that, but I wanted to talk about also emotion. I think it's very important, even in Boltanski work. And now it is a branch of research, academic research, notably in Quebec. Research team are working on archive and emotion, archive and creation, because this is very linked also, and how to make it possible for artists to have a better access to archive, because this is so important today. This is so important.
Okay. I do not know if I'm wrong, but I would say that many of these works, like Christian Boltanski and other, were related to the frames of archival organization, the ways of constructing history, and the desire to reread the past, proceeding to a rewriting of the history of modernity. However, today, it's not just a matter of dealing with that information about the past. In other words, there is a greater relationship with the future than with the past. Do you agree?
I would start my answer.
It's very impressive. It's my opinion. I don't know if I'm right.
I would agree with that, and I would start maybe with the quote of Ernst Friedrich Schumacher, who said, "The future can be forecast, but can be explained." And that also somehow, it's important to think about that link of past, present, and future as interconnected somehow. And also in this relationship between future and the past, and the future-oriented archive somehow as well, I'm also intrigued about this idea of an archive as a reflection or writing of a future. For example, I'm thinking also about the exhibition that Luce curated in Arles 2 years ago, that was about inventions, actually. And from the material point of view, we're dealing with the more classic archive, right? But it's, for me, completely future-oriented archive, because it shows how did people on the time imagine the future. And today, when we see it from this future that they had imagined, you know, it links us somehow and to our future as well, and to that past, and to the future they imagined that sometimes never happened, in terms of these inventions that sometimes never, you know, were moved forward. And it's very important, from my point of view, to see this relationship between future and past as something which is also moving, you know, and evolving.
I think I relate to what Yuliya said, because of course I work with what we can call classical archive, mainly, which are totally gathered, which have been totally gathered for the future. They've been preserved for the future. For example, this one you are talking about was created during the war. It's a mass archive of many inventions, it's like embryon beginnings of inventions that were taken in photo and preserved, because one day they could lead to something, but there were, you see, so there is a huge potential in archive, and sometimes some people have seen this potential, anticipated it, and preserved things. And like, I think the history of some archive, it's more linked to collections. The history of collection is very linked to individuals and obsessions, who were obsessed enough to preserve the documents. But this is a general answer, because of course there is a big difference in between a collection and an archive collection, a museum collection and an archive collection. An archive collection is much more organic. It's constricted with rules that are laws, that are strained by laws, that are standardized, and that are international laws and standards. And to me, the way photography is cared for in archive institution with the standards, is really much more adapted to photography than the way we deal with it in a museum. Why? Because in archive, you treat a group of documents with a lot of respect, and the concept is a respect of the fond, which is a group of documents. This is an official concept. You respect it. It's like a family. You don't, if you have a collection, an archive collection, you don't take something out of it. You preserve its integrity. This is another concept, very important. And you also respect the original order of the collection, because the collection has a structure. It's very organic, you know, it's a result of an activity. It was created through an activity. So it's and those concepts, like for example, in archive, you don't hierarchize documents. It means whether the image is positive or negative, you don't hierarchize, you accept them, and you don't sort out, and you don't put in the bin like that. And this is, I think these standards really fit with photography, and have avoided to get rid of things such as negatives. Museum today, they still carry on not preserving negatives. It's amazing, you know. It was in archive, in archive institution, negatives have been preserved. So, well, this is something very technical ideas I give you here, but I think it's part also of what is a photo archive. But of course, today, once again, a photo archive can be anything. It can be the photos that I buy today, I've bought today at the market, a flea market, and this will be added to my archive. But so that's it.
It's interesting when you say also about this idea of rewriting of the history, right? Because it also shows this idea of postmodern, you know, the concept of postmodern. And I would say that also it's interesting that I think that future-oriented archive, it's not here to rewrite the past, but maybe to question what was maybe hidden in some archive, and show these different approaches, and to emphasize the idea that the archive, or one archive, it doesn't consist the whole truth, or the whole, you know, the whole possibility of images or documents concerning this particular event, for example. And I think it's very important. And also about this idea of future and past and future-oriented archive, I think that it's also this the idea that the more we evolve in the study of archive, the more also this global consciousness about the partiality of the archive is present.
Okay. An interesting fact is that the concept of archive is more worked and known, but less fixed in its meaning. Okay. I don't know if you agree, but values such as the performativity, processuality, informality, and the essayistic experimental character of archival practice have gained greater prominence in many of the process of building archives. What is your view of the great difference between a classical archive and archive oriented towards the future?
To my point of view, this was an interesting question that has made me think, and I couldn't find a way to answer, because to me, a classical archive is definitely built towards the future. This is about the future. This is about preserving the present and preserving the past today for the people of tomorrow. This is definitely for the future. And and I think that relatively to what you said earlier, Yuliya, I also think that the desire to rereading the past, to understand it, is not ready to fade away. I mean, there are many ways to work with archives. they're not only for historians. More and more artists and curators are tempted to revision them, and each interpretation is different. And it's as if an archive could be reactivated indefinitely. I don't know. It has really a lot of potential, and the same archive will not be read in the same way in 50 years, or it wasn't, and the same. This is very fascinating. I'm thinking right now about Thomas Auvin, who's made, who had this great idea from one archive. He sent it to 3 different publishers, telling them, well, my project is that I'm sending it to 3 different publishers. I'm not saying to you who they are, but the final book will be the 3 books. And the 3 books are so different, you know, the 3 propositions, it's kind of unbelievable, anything that is possible. So I find that totally like there's no end to an archive.
Yeah.
It has something also close for me. It has really something close to, it's as if it's living, you know. I don't know if it's the word like vivant we say. It's very organic, and it's as it's never ending. It's like a blob a bit. It, you know, it's something that is in between living and not, and who cannot, it's stupid, cannot die, but
and for me, your question made me think about one quote from Alfredo Jar, who also worked a lot in his installations with his own archive. And the question of what's the difference between classic archive and contemporary archive would be his words like context is everything. So I think it's maybe not only about whether it's the archive in classic form or a contemporary archive, which can be digital, interactive, etc. But maybe it's about the manner of approaching the archive and how this manner of approaching the archive evolve, and how more and more artists and more visitors are active toward this archive, and how do they take it not as the knowledge that is written in stone, but it's a part of this knowledge that they can combine with some other information and with some other sorts of truth, you know, and connecting different temporalities. And again, this idea of kaleidoscope or constellations like come to my mind when I'm thinking about what's a future-oriented archive. And I think it's about these manners of with which we can approach it. And also I'm thinking that when I started this project, I was starting with the idea of archive as universal knowledge. And maybe this thought is something which is more classic and facing the past, because maybe
Very
there
modern.
is no.
Yeah, very modern.
Yeah, and maybe maybe this universal knowledge, it's not something that really exists, because there are many knowledge, you know, and many approaches, and maybe we don't have to look at the archive as the only possibility, or as like I really like what Luce explained about the difference between collection and archive, and about the mobility of and this alive character of the archive. And I think it's very important characteristic of something which is a contemporary archive, which is oriented towards the future. And somehow it can be like a message in the battle, but you know, like this capsule that we send to space with many elements. And we think that if ever there would be another civilization or whatever that can have this capsule, there are many different elements inside, right? That we think can represent who we are and our society, etc. And the archive is somehow, yeah, that's how I perceive also this idea of contemporary archive.
Sorry, I just wanted to add something to what Yuliya said. Is it possible?
Yes. I have a question about the definition of the future. The future is ahead or that is present?
Yeah, I understand, but I would like first, if it's possible, to say something related to what Yuliya said before.
Okay.
Is it possible? Yeah.
Please, please.
Yeah, no, because it's very interesting. You talked about universality and archive, and in what you said, it reminded me about a period in history around the beginning of the 20th century when the idea of preserving photography started to really grow, and it was very problematic because where to put photographs in libraries, in museums, in archives, etc. And it's very interesting to notice that the people who started really to create the first museums of photography, of the first archive of photography, they were all driven by this movement of universalism, internationalism, pacifism. It's very linked to and those people, while thinking about how to preserve photography, what to preserve, shall we keep everything? How to catalog that? Shall we do a catalog of the catalog of all the catalog of photography? Can we imagine a city where we gather all the photographs in the world and with a huge catalog? Even, you know, Paul Otlet, and even what's his name, the architect, very famous Swiss architect, comment il s'appelle, the so famous Swiss architect Le Corbusier made some plan for such a city in Geneva, a city of information that would gather all the catalog of catalogs. So what is very interesting is why did it happen at that time? Because all those people, they're writing it, they say, the world is changing so much, things are changing, everything is accelerating, many things are disappearing, etc. We must preserve this present to be able to think about it later, because this goes too fast, you know. And I find that sometimes, like, of course, there was a lot of big utopia behind that. They even thought of using Esperanto, the universal language, to describe and catalog those archives, those photo archives, in order that everybody would understand everything everywhere. So, but I think it's interesting how the past repeats itself regularly, and considering photo archives, this is something, those questions come back, and of course, photography related in comparison with traditional archive, which is mainly made of manuscript, documents, papers, administration documents. Photography is very different. It's disruptive. It's disruptive, and it's, even if it's anonymous, if we don't know anything, there is someone behind who has made some choices, like, and who has taken photos. In France, I'm sure it's the same in Portugal, but we have this author right that is strong. It's very strong. I mean, today I'm preparing a show for National Archive, and we're dealing with an archive of white goods from the 1930s, washing machines, things like that. They're anonymous, but we have, because they didn't do a contract at the time, we have to search for the photographer. And when we find them, it's very funny. Some of the photos are from the 50s, 70s, and we found Laure Albin Guillot, we found Sabine Weiss, we found Pierre et Gilles, and now, but these are not artistic images, but never mind. There is this question of author still somewhere behind the archive. Personally, I find that it's very interesting to this is more historian work, but to try and reconnect the archive to the producers, the multiple producers, and context of production, of course.
Can I add something? Because it also made me think about this idea of history repeating itself. You know, I think that sometimes archive enable us to find the reflections of our present, of how we imagine future in the images from the past. And it shows this sort of universality actually, but also it brings us to something which is very essential. It doesn't matter in which epoch or in each time. And it means maybe that it's something like the roots, it would be maybe too pathetic to say like the roots of humanity, etc., etc. But you know, something that doesn't belong to one particular temporality or one particular region, that there is something essential, for example.
That's historical, yeah.
In the terms of society, philosophy, etc. And maybe archive is also here to, you know, to reflect, to enable these reflections, you know, to connect like between past, present, and future, saying that this essential concept, the essential ideas about who we are and about the society as well, that they actually remain.
Okay. And how digital communications technologies have radically transformed and affected the conceptualization and the experience of the archive. What is going to happen with archives?
Well, to me, the major change is linked to materiality, of course, the space and the technology used to preserve the images. And of course, we all know that long-term preservation is very complicated for digital files, and the estimation, the life expectancy estimation of for a digital photo file is very low compared with a daguerreotype. And so this is a big challenge in terms of materiality. And what it has also much changed, my answer are not philosophical and very practical. It's regarding the access to the material, the fact that you can access to them more easily than before, especially, I don't know how it is in other countries, but especially with open data, with the will that this is really also archivistic institutions. They're really into sharing. I mean, it's in the law anyway, so they have to share their images when they are when the photographer is not dead, was dead less than 70 years before, the images should be common. So this has changed a lot. The access to images, yes, these are very. What else? I think also there's a shift in the practice of archivists, but I think I've already mentioned it, the fact that now archives really try to open their collection more to not only historians, but also to artists, to dancers, choreographers, cooker, like a chef, cook chief, sportive as well, and that is very, very interesting, all those encounters. And yes, what I also wanted to say that I think, I don't know what you think, Yuliya, about that, but the notion of archive is very different, the perception, from where you stand. For example, I met a Paraguayan artist in Mexico, and we talked. He works with archive that he found on the flea market in Paraguay, and he told me, for him, it's a question of life and death. It's very, very important, his work, because he's trying to put light on things that have been hidden by the government, and the archive have been destroyed. So I was very surprised. I said, but how can they destroy the archives? I mean, it's not legal. And he said, we don't have any rules for our archive. I mean, and we don't. And he said, I don't trust my government, or maybe not this one, but I don't trust governments to have well kept our archive. So he said that most of artists and historians there, they feel like they have to write their own history to contribute to the whole history. And this urge is not so strong, is different in France. In France, for example, I don't know in other countries. And I think this is important to also have that in mind, not to generalize about too much about archive, because it's different from one country to another, one continent to another.
It's a very interesting reflection, which is also relevant to our project, because we have in our 5 artists the work of George Seeley, who is talking about actually, whose work is based on the document that were secret actually in United States, and then they, like according to the law, now they're in public domain. And we can see there how, for example, US military services contributed in some atrocities that happened in South America, for example. And it's not something that we would like to show, or not we, but I mean, for example, the governments, etc. But as in the countries that are democratic, or rather maybe going more towards the democracy, we have this idea, we have the law that is really respected, and sometimes we can discover something that was hidden and that is even shocking, and that maybe we contradicted even these facts before in the political discourse when we were able not to show these documents. And it also make me reflect on the idea that archive is political. We can say that everything is political, but what you're saying, for example, I'm from Belarus, who lives in France today, so I can compare these different paradigms somehow. And when I think about Belarus and what's happening now there, and how also history and archive becomes an instrument of propaganda and of ideology, and with no compromise and with no idea that there is maybe some other sort of truth and a part of truth that is hidden and that can be also destroyed, because it's interesting that I'm not shocked at all about governments destroying the archives, because it seems even something, unfortunately, natural to me, to where I come from, and to these, the whole practices, for example, in Soviet Union during the years of Stalinism, etc. And it's interesting to think about that, about how do we approach this political character of an archive according to where do we come from and where we stand, as you said. I think it's very interesting. And I also maybe wanted to add something about the dynamic character of an archive, like it's a dynamic creation. And archive is constantly here to reinvent also its function and how do we use it. And somehow it's also this flow of images that we talked about before, which we can struggle to put in some particular context. And it's important when we think about archives and also digital or physical modes of representation, that we think about what meanings have each of these contexts of representation. And also the idea that even in each digital mode of presentation, there is a physicality of an image behind. Because most of the times, especially when we think about creations from the past, digital image is here just to reflect what's physically happened of this, I don't know, cyanotype or any other techniques actually. And thinking about this, what will happen to the archives, it's interesting to think how could they cohabit together, this materiality of the image and also this digital aspect that also brings the accessibility of an archive, which becomes larger. And it means that even the interpretation of the archive could be more wide, and the usage of it by artists or by historians or by ordinary people, for example. And it's also interesting to think that each country have its archive and it's written history, but for example, neighbor countries, they can talk about the same historical event very differently. And each country, for like historians of one country would have one approach, And it's very important to realize actually this difference. And I think that what digitalization can offer to us is this opportunity actually to access to these different archives and to take different elements and to develop this critical vision and critical approach to an archive as a spectator, actually.
Well,
yeah, I think what you say is very interesting, and I'm very happy to hear you saying that, because it's also an energy. It's very interesting because what is fascinating with archives and photo archive is that we know we feel. I know there are a lot of them that have not been yet exploited, that have not been yet revisioned. And each time someone somewhere we work on a group of image, it changes. It can change everything in the way we in our imaginary, also in the way the official history has been constructed, and also simply the history of photography. Today, it's my generation, we learned about photography through reproductions. And now most of young historians, I hope, I'm sure they work with material, they have access, but they, and no, I forgot what I wanted to say, but I know it's important. It's yes, it's this question of the disruption of photography. It's the history. Now I think the idea of a history of photography is a bit dead because of archives, because it's always changing, and the big dogma that have been constructed were also very authoritarian in terms of how to think photography, and archive is always like with repetition. It deconstructs this history. It, of course, it adds new things, and it forces us to think with no no basement, no standard, to be very, like you said, like very flexible, very like because there is no one truth, but many. And as you said, it depends also. This archive it can be reinterpreted in many ways in different time and at the same moment, and also it can be seen in other ways, whether it's seen from the other country that is linked to this history, or this one that is not at all linked to this history. So this is a very interesting material, and I think for young researcher, it's a huge program. It's a program for I don't know how many years, but
for life. It's a lifetime project.
Lives, yeah, very interesting.
Well, thank you so much for this insightful conversation and for raising so many questions, so many interesting questions. I learned a lot.
Thank you a lot.
Yeah. Do you want to leave a message for the future?
I would say that a message for the future, or rather about the future-oriented archive, that I would like to say in the end of this discussion is that maybe it's important to break this usual cycle of this hierarchy that we have between the big archive and us, the small people somehow, and consider ourselves not as the passive spectators or visitors, but as active users or creators actually of the archive and also of the future somehow, and to see these multiple possibilities of interpreting and also creating something based on different archives, and considering the idea that whether the archive is future oriented or not, it depends also in what do we do with this archive.
Mm-hmm. I would be very happy if you could tell us 2 words about your exhibition, because is it going to be closed, or is it postponed?
It didn't actually happen physically, and also we were preparing this exhibition as a physical one, but then the COVID happened and we made a digital project, actually this website that maybe you had seen, and the publication as well. And we will normally do this exhibition in Łódź Photo Festival, if everything goes well. I think Rebecca can confirm or not this option. So I hope that we will have this possibility to show this exhibition physically.
So when will it be?
In Poland in June.
June.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, and I think it would be very interesting, because also this exhibition is, or this project, I would say, because there's digital part and publication, it was also something constantly evolving with the time and the context, and we imagined with the artists collectively. It was actually really process-based collective process with the artists, which was an incredible chance actually for me, and they said that for them as well. I hope it's truth. And yeah, this opportunity to reinvent actually the project, as we can reinvent the archive. It's really, really exciting.
Thank you.
Well, thank you a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was really very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you to both of you. It was so interesting to hear your insights and your experiences. And of course, thank you to Sandra for giving us the seeds of this conversation. And wish you a nice day.
With more reflections about archives.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. See you.